así que empezamos inmediatamente. Pero antes de esto vamos a leer entonces los antecedentes del Dr. Haines. El señor Richard Haines es de nacionalidad norteamericana, nacido en Seattle, estado de Washington, el 19 de marzo de 1937. Es casado y padre de 2 hijas. Es licenciado en Psicología en el Instituto Luterano del Pacífico, Tacoma, en 1960. Obtuvo la maestría en 1962 y el doctorado en 1964 en Psicología Experimental, ambos en la Universidad Estatal de Michigan. Es investigador asociado de la Asociación Médica Aeroespacial y miembro de numerosas asociaciones de psicología, de sociedades de ingenieros y actualmente miembro de la Agrupación Profesional de Factores Humanos, HFP, del Instituto Americano de Aeronáutica y Astronomía. Ha sido investigador científico de Recon Technologies Incorporated en San José, California, del Instituto de Investigación para la Ciencia de Computación Avanzada en el Centro de Investigación Ames, NASA, en Moffett Field, California, de la Oficina de Factores Humanos Espaciales, investigador de la División de Ciencias para la Vida, investigador del Consejo Nacional de Investigación, todas del Centro de Investigación Ames de la NASA. Ha realizado consultorías para la Universidad de Stanford, Escuela de Medicina, en materias como efectos del monóxido de carbono en la sensibilidad visual, para el grupo del sistema TRW en Los Ángeles, en efectos de los flashes lumínicos en la subsecuente capacidad visual, además de testigo experto en 12 casos de colisiones, accidentes entre aeronaves y vehículos terrestres. El Dr. Haines es autor de más de 75 artículos científicos para revistas especializadas de psicología y de optometría, más de 20 informes técnicos para la NASA y la FAA, además de 35 ensayos en reuniones nacionales e internacionales y la producción de 3 películas de carácter técnico para la NASA. Como una actividad absolutamente extracurricular, el Dr. Haines ha escrito más de 25 artículos técnicos publicados en las principales revistas de América, Inglaterra y Alemania, dedicada al fenómeno OVNI. Asimismo, ha publicado 6 libros científicos acerca de fenómenos aéreos no identificados, de los cuales destacamos El fenómeno OVNI y el comportamiento científico, en 1979, La observación de OVNIs, en 1980, y el episodio Mervyn, estudio del caso de un piloto desaparecido, en 1987. Dejo con ustedes entonces al Dr. Richard Haines con el tema Mecanismo de energía fractal, un nuevo concepto para explicar diversas características del fenómeno aéreo anómalo. Mr. Haines.
General Bermudez, distinguished guests, members of the armed forces, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be here in Santiago, my first time. And I must say that it reminds me much of California, in San Francisco. And I feel it's a great honor to be here as a participant in the FIDAE 2000 event, which in itself is very significant. But it's also an honor to be the first speaker at this particular Seminario OVNI. And I will try my best to communicate clearly on a complex subject. I must also say that I am here as a citizen only and not speaking on behalf of my employer. Now, being the first speaker in the morning allows me to look out and see what I would call true believers who take this subject seriously and are willing to show up early in the morning. So my presence here is going to be to present a theoretical subject. I was requested to share with you my ideas related to two different subjects, OVNI and fractal geometry. And so this presentation is dealing with new theories that General Bermudez mentioned earlier this morning as one of the objectives of this presentation, this FIDAE 2000 seminar. I will try to accomplish this within 1 hour with your attention. And I will know when to stop when I hear snoring in the back of the room. So please permit me to begin. Next slide, please. There's the outline of what I will be presenting today. I'm going to begin by telling you some of my assumptions behind this work. Second, how I discovered the relationship between fractal geometry and certain characteristics of OVNI. I will then tell you very briefly what fractals are and show you examples. Number 4, I will show you photographic evidence that I have found of OVNI that tell me there may be a fractal effect involved. And then I'm going to concentrate on the core of my presentation, which is the fractal energy exchange mechanism, which I call FEEM, F-E-E-M. I'm then going to talk about, very briefly, 4 characteristics that we find in UFO sightings that I believe can be explained by FEEM, right here. And finally, I will conclude. Next slide, please. What about initial assumptions? First of all, I must make it clear that I believe UFO phenomena exist. Not only that, they occupy at least 3-dimensional space and time. By saying this, I eliminate hallucinations. I eliminate mental projection phenomena. Third, I assume, one of my assumptions is that the surface of the UFO can both emit and reflect light. Next, I believe that both motion pictures and still photographs have been taken of UFOs. And that what we see on these photographs do not represent cloaking or stealth technology or light ray modification during the photography. And what I'm trying to say there is that the photographs, the good photographs, represent traditional optical principles, not new optical principles. Finally, you may want to lift that up if you could just a little bit, please. That I believe that we can gain useful insights about UFO design, energy management, and flight control dynamics by looking very carefully at UFO photographs and considering FEEM, the fractal energy exchange mechanism. Next slide. Now, how did I first discover this relationship? It came from a set of photographs I received from Gulf Breeze, Florida, taken January 8th of 1990 in the dark sky of the evening. And for over 5 minutes' time, 3 people near the beach of Gulf Breeze, which is a resort town, noticed a small, red, very bright light hovering in the sky. 2 of the people had their own cameras, good quality cameras. Next slide, please. I'm going to be showing you a photograph shortly, taken with a 35mm single lens reflex camera with a 200mm telephoto lens, Kodak film. Next slide, please. The event took place here. This is the Gulf of Mexico, Pensacola, and Gulf Breeze is right here. The object was seen in the sky over the Gulf of Mexico some distance. Next slide, please. Well, here we see the first of three pictures. This is a computer rendering of this red, intense spot of light, which looks much like a human kidney in shape. This picture was taken at 1/250th of a second duration with a handheld camera, no tripod. Next slide, please. You're going to see a enlargement later on this morning of the second picture that was taken by the same camera but different photographer trying different settings on his camera. But what I would like to point out here is this structure, and there's one here, and there's one here that you don't see. You will see them later. This edge effect or edge detail of the Gulf Breeze photographs is very much larger in size than these tiny grains of film, the chemical grains of film, by approximately 100 times. So what I will be saying today is the effect we're talking about, the fractal-like effect, is not a film grain effect. Next slide, please. Now, a third subject, what are fractals? The word fractal comes from the Latin word fractus, which means broken or fragmented or segmented, basically. The first person to give serious attention to this was a Frenchman, Benoit Mandelbrot, and here is his definition for what a fractal is. But to put it most simply, to me a fractal is a way of quantifying a shape such that you can scale the shape in different sizes and it will still maintain the same dimension. A number representing it will be constant no matter how you will scale it. Next slide, please. For instance, let us begin with a single spot right here. In fractal terminology, this is called a seed, much like the seed of a plant that you put in the ground. And later on, it grows into a larger plant. By applying what we call an algorithm, a formula that adds detail, we add 4 dots to the one seed. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have this. We then take this and do the same thing. We add each of these as a single dot to the original, and we have this, and so forth. And you see it grows very quickly. These numbers here represent the fractal dimension, the number that represents this particular kind of growth pattern of the fractal. Now you can go from small to large or large to small, and that's very important. Here you start with a large seed and take information away from it. And so we here, and so forth, until at the scale dimension it becomes very, very precise and fine too. Next slide, please. There are a great many kinds of fractals that have been proposed over the years. Dr. Mandelbrot certainly should be at the top of the list, I believe. And it's formed by iterating a formula. What that means is using a computer to repeat the same algorithm over and over and over again, thousands, millions of times. But as you may see here, there are many other kinds of fractals. Next slide, please. Here you're going to see a Mandelbrot example of a Mandelbrot fractal. And as you can see, this circle here is duplicated here, is duplicated here, is duplicated here, and so forth, to infinity. If you have a large enough computer, you can go to infinity. Most people don't need to do that. Next slide, please. In this next fractal, this is called a Newton pattern. It's a beautiful image, and it is this entire fractal is generated by that equation right there. It's an elegant way of presenting detailed information with a very simple equation. Now, this image I like because it is symmetrical, it is round, it does have peripheral processes or extensions to it. It does have the principle of multiplication, which is large, small, 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 small. And it does have the principle of rotation, which would be an axis, a new axis, a new axis, and so forth. Next slide, please. So this then suggests that, oops, there's another one. Well, this is just to illustrate fractals do not have to be symmetrical. They can be rotated in regular steps, and some of them are very beautiful. They're almost works of art. Next slide, please. Here you may see an axis of symmetry here, so that if you folded the image over, it would be the same on the left and the right. This is a fractal image. It's created by a very simple formula that the computer will recalculate many, many times. Next slide, please. So, let me suggest to you that there are three major factors that relate to fractal geometry. They are rotation, going from this orientation to this, or to this, or to some other. There is scaling, or S factor, which goes from this size of an object to a larger object or a smaller object. And there is division, or D factor, going from one object to two objects, to four objects, to 8 objects, or so forth. But remember that D can go from 16 to 8 to 4 to 2 to 1. Go both directions. So, with these three simple dimensions, that is all that is required. Could you raise it up, please, a little higher? That's all required to produce the majority of shapes found in nature. So that the tip of a fern from the jungle can be a duplicate of the entire plant. It's a small copy of the entire plant. Next slide, please. Well, here we have another fractal. This is a beautiful one, where we have the seed. This would be considered the seed, but the seed is germinating. It is reproducing itself, so to speak, in a biological sense. This is nothing but an optical photograph, picture off of a computer screen. But you'll notice that in this illustration, we have scaling, which is the size factor, going from larger to smaller. We have the rotation factor by the different orientations of these lines. And we have the splitting factor, the division factor, D, going from basically from one to many. Next slide. And I believe that all of these ideas relate to OVNI. That's not going to show. I'm sorry. You can take it off, turn it off for just a moment. I'm going to suggest to you that in general, a fractal pattern is going to remain symmetrical in three-dimensional space if you hold both rotation and scaling constant. Now, what does that mean? That if you see an OVNI that maintains its geometry, its shape, its size, and so forth, I'm suggesting that someone or something is holding the rotational factor and the scaling factor constant of the mechanism inside that OVNI. Next slide, please. Just very briefly here, I believe that irregular surfaces and interfaces are found throughout all of nature. And that this principle is natural, we call it natural, we call it self-replicating. At the DNA level of the human body, for instance, we can replicate from parents to child, to the next generation, to the next generation. That's what we mean by self-replicating. We don't have great differences from generation to generation. That's in nature. How about in human society and intelligence? I think that the mind has a driving force to create smooth, regular, geometrically repeating surfaces and interfaces. Now, many times we do that for efficiency or to save cost. When we're building airplanes, we want 20,000 of the same airplane. We don't want 20,000 different airplanes. It would be too expensive. And so we use the word manufactured or duplicated. Would you lift it up, please? So, what does this suggest about the shape of UFOs, the surfaces of UFOs, and the interface between the object and the environment around it, the air, for instance? Are UFOs manufactured in our sense of the word here? Because many of them have smooth, regular surfaces. Nature does not. Can we say from that that UFOs are manufactured rather than natural effects from nature? Next slide, please. I next raise the question, how do things change their size and shape? And I would suggest to you they do that by some sort of extension. In other words, they have to begin at some location. Some seed must pre-exist in order for growth to occur from that seed. Next, I will suggest that some form of energy must be transferred to or from the edge or boundary into the surrounding space, in three-dimensional space. So, what is the nature of this original edge or boundary, and what is the nature of the energy transferred? Next slide. I'm going to show you a few photographs now, in addition to Gulf Breeze, that suggest a fractal edge on the UFO. The first comes from New York, January, the second from Costa Rica in 1971, and the third from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. But I would like to make a request that if any of you here today have UFO photographs that would have these kinds of effects, I would very much like to talk with you. To see, because I scanned this at only 260 dpi, but you can see something of the protrusions at the bottom. Next slide, please. In this frame, the object moved closer and changed angle, and you can just see the protrusions on the bottom, not on the top. And this is film grain. This is blowing up the image so large that you see the individual spots of silver halide. Next slide. Now at this point I must tell you that when a plasma, basically an ionized gas, is compressed by very strong magnetic fields, basically in a laboratory, a physics laboratory setup, what is usually formed are complex shapes called plasmoids. And one kind of plasmoid is a very thin filament or a shred which forms spirals within the magnetic field lines of the chamber. Let me suggest to you that the photographs you have just seen from Leroy, New York, represent this kind of effect of a hydromagnetic property of plasma in a very intense magnetic field. Next slide. So, let me take you to Costa Rica in September of 1971, and I'll go very briefly here. There's a large article that has been written by myself and Dr. Villet on this case. but a government airplane was flying at 10,000 feet altitude. Its job was to take photographs of the ground every 20 seconds using a very accurate camera. On one of the frames taken, next slide please, as the airplane is flying in a straight line, here's Lake Arenal, here, it's flying on a straight line, next slide please. Near Lake Arenal is the Lago de Cote, which is a small lake here. Here's Arenal here, down in the corner. This is to the northeast. This was the location of the OVNI that was photographed from above by the government airplane. Next, I show you an enlargement of the OVNI. Next slide. This is a very large, symmetrical, oval object, approximately 200 feet across, we think. But and we received the original negative from the Costa Rican government, which was 9 by 9 inches in size. Very large, professional. And what the negative shows us, well, many things, but one thing is, this is not fake. This is not a blemish or an artifact on the negative. This is a real aerial object, at least 10,000 feet at the surface of the lake or closer. But the front edge of it, this edge right here, is perfectly smooth. The top edge is not smooth at all. There is a fractal-like pattern back here, but not here. Next slide, please. Here's a little larger picture of this. It looks to be a cone with a point here, with, seen from the top perhaps. There seems to be a third dimension to it. We don't know what size, perhaps 20 feet here thick, and we don't know what the other side looks like. So this to me represents a fractal kind of image when you do the analysis at better resolution. Next slide, please. I believe the next and last slide is from Yaroslavl, Russia. This photograph was taken in the late 1980s. And again, it shows a fairly smooth surface here and a very interesting non-smooth edge on the other side. Well, these are just several of the examples of what I would consider fractal geometry coming from UFO photographs. Next slide, please. Let me turn now to the subject of the fractal exchange, energy exchange mechanism. I will refer to it as FEED to save time. What is the definition of this idea? It is a hypothetical way of distributing high energy from a central core or seed in the fractal sense to surrounding three-dimensional space very quickly, very accurately, in order to produce a desired effect. Concept of energy seed. I propose that the UFO contains, draws upon, or calls upon, uses, and somehow manipulates at least one core source of very high energy, extremely high energy. And antimatter has been proposed, or gravity wave energy source has been proposed, and even zero-point energy has been proposed for space application, outer space travel applications. The seed is most likely located at the geometric center, but this is not a requirement. I think from a human design point of view, that would make most sense. So, would you raise it up, please? The internal energy control mechanisms are very possibly three-dimensional in nature, probably segmented, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, where there's an energy collection mechanism, a focus mechanism, and what I call a diversion or diverter mechanism, and then a segmented outer surface. Next slide. Now I take you back to Gulf Breeze, this nighttime photograph that was taken, and I've already shown you these areas here in yellow. You can see a central core, which was this red kidney-shaped object in the previous photograph by a different photographer. Here we have the same camera, but different photographer about 3 minutes later. And what we find are evenly spaced regions here around the circumference of the core. Next slide, please. This is simply a black and white reproduction. This was a color original. Let me propose an energy radiator here and here, this going in this direction and this radiation going here and here, this radiator going here, and so forth. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. We can now measure the angle between these lines. We can measure the distance from the origin to the new intersection here. Next slide, please. I'm going to suggest to you, and this is controversial, and I don't expect you to accept it right away, that the seed is here, that this is what we call the original boundary of the OVNI, and that at A, B, C, D, we have these energy projections coming out from the surface, this original boundary, to intersect at A prime, B prime, C prime, all the way around. And at the intersection, we have energy concentrating. And in the Earth's atmosphere, this can produce ionization. It can produce luminosity and special colors, depending on how much energy is given and the gases at that location, oxygen, nitrogen, argon, and so forth. Next slide. So, here we have the seed, here we have A and B as before, and what I call the original boundary. In the Gulf Breeze photograph, this would be the red kidney core. This would represent that new formation of points, which I am now calling a new boundary being formed in real time, here. So it's going from this boundary location to this boundary location. In what way? By controlling the amount of energy from each of these sources here, which comes from here originally, and controlling this angle, x and y, x prime and y prime, so that they intersect in a new area right here. But by changing x and y, they could be focused to here, so that the new boundary would now be formed farther away. You see that this might possibly explain the the size changes of OVNI that have been reported. Next slide. Now let's consider an OVNI from the side. This is looking at the OVNI from the side and then cutting it in half so you see inside of it. Remember, this is theoretical. This is just hypothesis. Here we have what I would call the core or the seed or the energy source here. This would be the original boundary we're talking about at the moment. And here we have some mechanism for collecting the energy from the seed here, and I use an optics analogy like a lens, collecting light, of a telescope, for instance. And using this diverter mechanism, the energy can be focused along the axis of the UFO if necessary, here, or by diverting it, we can go to here, or anywhere, vertically. So I would like you to be thinking of this lens right here in the idea of a segmented surface, that the entire surface of the OVNI can be covered with these kind of mechanisms that receive energy from here. So we can expect intense ionization in the Earth's atmosphere at each of the focal points. In this case, here, or wherever it happens to be focused, all right? Well, we don't have time. I think I'll move on. Next slide. Now, I believe there are at least 4 phases of the energy control mechanism that must be involved. A generation phase, a formatting phase, a distribution phase, and then a dissipation phase. The generation must come from the seed, but whether the seed is always at the center of the object, I don't know. There are physicists today studying the possibility that energy can be drawn from outside the object into the object somehow, anywhere in space. And this work by Dr. Hal Puthoff in the United States of America has been doing some very important work. I think he will have a Nobel Prize if anyone does from this work. The formatting issue. We must take this package of energy and somehow divide it up into the proper directions and angles and so forth, and in what I call temporal packets. That it isn't a continuous stream of energy, it's a pulsed energy. And this formatting would have to include storage of the energy for later use as well. Like a battery, perhaps, although it can't be a battery effect. Next we have distribution phase, where we have to transfer this formatted energy now from the seed area to some new location. And let me call it a temporary edge, all right? And this distribution phase must include some sort of switching, routing of the energy. Much like a telephone company will switch or route your telephone call from your home to wherever you're calling. This is not a simple technology, obviously. Finally, dissipation. Here we have the interaction of this energy with the air or the space around the UFO, causing ionization and what I would call breakdown artifacts. Certain colors that are distinctive of oxygen or nitrogen or the gases in the air, all right? And perhaps interacting with gravitation and even the inertial field of the object. Next slide, please. Now let me turn to another dimension of theme, which is the segmented outer surface. And let me suggest to you that what you and I see on a photograph or video or our eye of an OVNI, it may look metallic. But let me suggest it may not be metallic at all, or solid. But it may be composed of temporary, microscopically small areas of localized energy, concentrated energy coming from the same seed. Now, using fractal control dynamics in three-dimensional space inside the OVNI, in order to control the projectors of energy, I believe that this is the mechanism that UFOs change their shape, their size, their color, their intensity, which can be done almost instantaneously, very fast. Next, would you raise it up, please? Also, I'm suggesting that the flight, not the navigation, but the flight control, the trajectory of OVNI, could be controlled by using differential energy application to different parts of the surface of the object, the phenomenon, let's call it. Next slide, please. Now, just to give a basic idea of what I'm talking about, I don't use an airplane as an example. I use a disc or a frisbee. And it's simply, this is portion of an oblate spheroid where the surface is broken into thousands or millions of very small apertures or areas within which energy can be concentrated independently, perhaps in phase or in frequency or some other characteristic, certainly intensity, that can produce both a horizontal gradient and a vertical gradient over the surface of the object. Next slide, please. Now let me show you an analogy from some NASA work that's been done. And I found a very interesting project that NASA has been working on for supersonic wing. In order to control the flow of air over the top of the wing, the idea is to reduce the drag of the air over the top of a supersonic wing in order to save fuel for the high-speed civil transport, the supersonic transport. The solution was found in producing a very smooth airflow. We call it a laminar or layered airflow over the top of the wing. How was this done? By installing an air suction system inside the wing within the fuselage to feed or lead to millions of tiny holes, laser holes cut in the top surface of the wing. Next slide, please. So, here we have the F-16XF model, number 1 of 1. There's only one of these at NASA, at Edwards Air Force Base. Here is the test section that we're talking about. And this wing surface here is made up of millions of very tiny holes. Next slide, please. So, this is a photograph of that surface of the wing magnified many times. This is an American dime. This is a 10-cent piece, approximately 17 millimeters across in diameter. So you can see how small these holes are. They're cut with a laser, but they allow a vacuum inside the wing to create a smooth boundary over the top of the surface of the wing. Well, this is, next slide. This is nothing but a terrestrial example, illustration of what I'm talking about for extraterrestrial, perhaps, at least the fractal energy concept. Now I turn to the next major subject here. I'm going to suggest there are at least 4 visual characteristics of UFOs which can be explained by FIDAE, the fractal energy exchange mechanism. The first part, I will tell you cases that involve very slowly extending beams of light which appear to be solid in nature and which extend out from a UFO, and also cases of evenly spaced colored lights, sometimes white, around the circumference of the UFO. And I'm sure those of you who study this subject know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like this. Next, I will talk about shape changes of UFOs. Third, about how color and intensity are affected during acceleration of UFOs. And finally, non-symmetric UFO forms or shapes. Shapes that are asymmetric. Next slide. I believe that we can explain each of these characteristics using the FIDAE. So that the fractal energy mechanism model or hypothesis, to me, provides a useful explanation for each of these effects. Next slide. Let me begin then with slowly extending beams of light coming from UFO. Next slide. In a number of cases, a large number of cases, UFOs have been seen to give off or emit slowly propagating or extending luminous beams of light. These beams have sharp edges. They're not fuzzy. They're usually like a spotlight in clear air. They usually are of uniform luminosity, which gives them an appearance of solidity, but they're not really solid. Here's an example from, I believe, the Trancos case, yes, many years ago, where a woman put her arm into this beam of light, this beam, whatever it was, and she felt heat, but the beam was not altered in any way. Her arm did not cast a shadow on the ground. If there are physicists in the room, I would love to hear your explanation for that. Would you lift it up, please? Another case where a square beam came down from above, entered a room through a window frame, came through the window, but was not occluded or shaped by the shape of the window. It had the original shape. The inside shape of the beam was the same shape as the outside of the house. And interestingly, the room was not illuminated. Normally, light will reflect off of the wall or the floor or the ceiling or whatever and bounce and reflect, yes? That did not happen here. Here's another case of a solid red beam of light which came to an end and just stopped. Now, you take my laser beam here, and wherever I point it, it goes all the way to the surface. What happened in this case was this. It came to my hand and stopped there and wouldn't go beyond. But there was nothing, my hand wasn't there. You understand? Does that make sense? The beam truncated. The beam stopped with an end, although there was nothing stopping it. We don't know why. Next slide, please. A little more information on solid light beams. Here's a comment from Europe by a witness of a solid beam case. He said, "My first impression was that the machine, the OVNI, stood on the ground by means of legs or pillars, like landing gear, yes? Then I realized that they weren't legs at all, but beams of light." Well, if that OVNI possesses mass, and if it's close to the surface of our planet, it will have a gravity effect. And so there's going to be a compression load of the object on the light beams. Or it is levitating on its own power. It's able to suspend itself, and these light beams have nothing to do with support. They may be sensors of some sort. Well, let me move on. Here's a case where several publications from Europe have reviewed many, many instances of beams of light. And they found that the beams can elongate from the OVNI, whatever direction, at between 13 and 26 kilometers per hour. And this review found from 13 to 19 kilometers per hour. That's not very fast. How do you control the elongation of a beam of light this way, in real time? They found that the beam diameters vary typically from 5 centimeters to 3 meters, typically. They found that the beams can curve. These lines here. This beam is always straight, yes? From here to the screen, straight line. Well, if you're in outer space next to a black hole, the physicists will tell us that the beam can be bent from gravitation and interaction between the photons, the light, the photons, and the field that it's in. This may be what's happening here. But if it is, the radius is small radius would require a very, very large gravitational field. Probably so much so that trees would immediately compress, and anything vertical might fall down or be compressed into almost nothing because of the gravitation. So it probably is not gravitational. I don't know. The beams can vary in color from bluish-white, usually bluish-white, but they can be other colors as well. And they can vary in brightness from very dim to very, very bright. Next slide, please. Now I take you to 1952 at night, where a U.S. Air Force B-29 flight crew tracked a UFO in Japan. This OVNI was seen both visually from the cockpit as well as from radar. Another interceptor pilot was scrambled. He took off very quickly, in other words, to investigate, to help out. And that pilot, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, saw the OVNI as having rotating lights and 3 fixed beams of light. These beams of light effect are not just seen by farmers or elderly people with bad eyesight. They're seen by trained observers. Next slide. Another case, 1956 from Lakewood, California, 3:30 in the morning. This is a very interesting case. 3 adult females living in their own separate apartments were awakened early in the morning. Why? Because their rooms became as bright as day suddenly. Brighter than daylight, actually. This intensity changed from white to red after several seconds. One of the witnesses, a nurse, Mrs. Ager, looked at the window, out the window, and she saw a circular UFO with a small bright light at its center, and very interestingly, evenly spaced, wire-like feelers. We don't know what feelers are, perhaps like antenna on an airplane. It hovered in midair. Suddenly, the feelers began to rotate like a pinwheel, faster and faster around the object. And after 3 or 4 revolutions, the object shot off into the sky at an incredible speed, leaving in a matter of seconds. And she was temporarily blinded by the brightness. Next slide. This next event occurred in 1959 in September in Redmond, Oregon, early in the morning for quite a long time, as you can see. There was one UFO, but it was witnessed by Air Route Traffic Control radar in Seattle and Mount Hebo in Oregon, radar operators and police officers and many other witnesses on the ground. And it lasted at least 60 minutes, and that's one of the reasons there were so many witnesses. What did they see? They saw the object, in one case, this is one of the descriptions, at 4:59 in the morning, almost 5 o'clock, the object hovered and gave small oscillations and giving off a heat-like radiation. About 6 minutes later, the object projected long tongues of red, yellow, and green light of various lengths, extending and retracting at irregular times. Remember back to the fractal drawing of the intersecting beams of energy coming out and causing a light effect at the intersection point. At 5:15, the object changed its shape to a mushroom and emitted long yellow and red flames from its bottom side now. So the fractal effect does not only come out the sides, it can come out the top or the bottom. It must occur in 3-dimensional space. And finally, it rose straight up from 3,000 feet to 54,000 feet from the radar, 2 separate radar systems, and they scrambled an F-102 jet from the Oregon Air National Guard. And the jet interceptors approached the object, and then it departed. Next slide. This event comes from February 1979 in South Carolina, in America. There were many witnesses, one object, after dark, but in the evening. 4 teenage boys saw this large object, and this is the drawing by one of the boys. In the middle was a red light. It was surrounded by a brilliant white surrounding area here, and it had white lights and beams. And these are the beams that were shooting out, it said. This concept of a ray coming from an OVNI is very common. We don't know what those rays are. If they're defensive, if they are offensive, if they are some form of communication, if they're merely an artifact of energy exchange between the core, the object itself, and the surrounding environment. Well, the object was larger than an airplane, and it moved around very erratically. Next slide, please. I'm trying to go quickly. There are many, many cases like this. I have put 2 separate cases on one slide. In this first case, 1978, there were more than 6 witnesses in New Jersey, and they all recorded seeing this shaped object with colors red, green, yellow, white, which flashed in sequence along the periphery here. At each end was a bright white light, which is also quite common. Once again, I remind you of the fractal energy exchange mechanism that would have locations around the surface of the object, which might be represented here perhaps. Each one could have a different color very easily by pumping the appropriate amount of energy from inside the object to ionize the gases of the air to their excitation level to produce these colors. And from physics we know for a long time, well over 100 years, what those colors are and how many there are. There are hundreds, by the way. Well, if you lift it up just a little bit. The second case took place in 1981, after dark in Los Angeles. There were more than 2 witnesses, and once again, it was a rather long cigar, many years later, of course. The first in 1978, this is 81. The witnesses called them windows. They thought these were windows, but I don't think they are, frankly. I would call them electrodes, if I would call them anything. Right? Maybe cathodes. But nonetheless, they said they were even distance apart. They were along a straight line, and they were intense white. And there were very small bluish-green running lights. That's also a very biased term to our aviation experience, as they may not be running lights at all, just as these may not be windows. But nonetheless, you see a similarity here, and there are dozens and dozens of cases at least like this, perhaps more. Next slide. Now I turn to the next subject of shape changes. Next slide, please. There are many cases recorded where the OVNI changes shape while you're looking at it, or while you're photographing it. In this case of May 1953, took place in Yuma, Arizona, in the morning. It was a fairly nice day. There was 1 witness and 1 OVNI. The witness said he saw a small white cloud on a very clear blue sky. It was just a cloud, but the rest of the sky was clear, so he looked at the cloud, yes? As he's looking at it, he then saw an oblong object which slowly comes out of the cloud over a 5-minute period of time. And it's about 1/2 of a degree in length. The object then turns direction abruptly, very quickly, to the north, and it changes shape. It now goes from an oblong shape to a circular shape, and it gets smaller. It then disappears from sight over a 30-second period. While he's looking at it, it just disappears. The fractal exchange mechanism suggests that you can collapse as well as expand. This would explain perhaps rapid disappearance effects. Well, the witness was wearing polarized sunglasses. Perhaps you could lift that up just a little more. This is very important, I think. He was wearing sunglasses that had polarizing filter in them. And what he saw in the blue sky at that same location were several equally spaced rings around it, around that area. The largest was about 6 times the diameter of the disk. And let me suggest that he was fortunate enough to see what we call Faraday rings. It's an optical effect of polarization in the atmosphere, all right, by magnetic field. Next slide. Next, we have a case where, if you lower it just a moment, lower it all the way there. We're going from a ball to a mushroom shape. Now you can raise it up. This took place in 1959 at 5 o'clock in the morning in Redmond, Oregon. 2 policemen and an FAA specialist were witnesses to this case, and 1 UFO. It was seen at first like a meteor that was falling down. Then it came to a stop and hovered as a ball. So first it was a flaming meteor, it stopped as a ball, then it became a flat and round object with tongues of flame coming out from the rim from time to time. This was viewed through binoculars. And then it changed into a mushroom shape with long yellow and red flames coming from the underside. So clearly, there's some form of energy emitted by the object into the surrounding air, in a similar manner to the FEAM concept. Finally, an airplane was approaching, a high-speed airplane. It was a military jet. And as it came, the UFO rose and disappeared into an overcast cloud above, basically. Next slide. In this next case, in July of 1960, we start with a donut-shaped cloud, which gives off a fireball and flames, and it appears to drift right over the top of an American Air Force base. I'm sorry, a Japanese Air Force base in Honshu. This lasted over 5 minutes. After dark, after midnight. The location, again, was Honshu, the mainland of Japan. There were 14 ground and air crew witnesses to this event and 1 UFO. Well, what happened? The 10 witnesses on the ground who were air policemen and 4 Japanese civilian guards saw a luminous white cloud coming from northwest to southeast, slowly over the airbase. Above this cloud was solid overcast of cloud, again at 36,000 feet. Now if you could raise it up once more, please. This cloud spread open in its middle, and what was seen in the middle of that was a bright red-orange glow with streaks of flame coming out from its sides, just as before. The center then faded from sight, and within another minute, the cloud now looked like a donut with a dark center. You know what donut is in Spanish? Okay. Then the cloud disappeared to the east over the next 4 minutes. And I must, in all honesty, tell you that some experts who studied this case in the Air Force, the American Air Force, Project Blue Book, believe this was a Soviet missile test from Turtam in the going to the mid-Pacific target area in the Pacific Ocean. Next slide. Next, I turn to the subject of acceleration and color. Next slide. Let me suggest to you that since acceleration of mass requires the application of additional energy, which is just a physical principle. Second, that the UFO very often changes color and intensity when they accelerate, as I will show you in a minute. Third, if there is a constant relationship between the amount of energy given off or absorbed, either way, by the UFO, taking in energy or giving it off, doesn't matter, then this might well produce particular colors and intensities as a product of this additional energy. So it's not the constant energy so much as the additional energy, the change in energy. And then if you would raise it up for Amy Michel in 1967, and this should be read in French, of course, but I don't read French, I'm sorry. I will read it in English. The colors mentioned in many OVNI reports seem to be associated in some way with the speed, or more probably with the rate of acceleration. The silvery gray with an aureole or a halo of dark red when the object is stationary or traveling very slowly. Then comes vivid red, and finally, at high acceleration, white, green, blue, or purple might appear. Next slide. I'm almost done. Well, in America, the NICAP organization years ago studied 107 reports that involved details of color and brightness of OVNI. And they found that in 18 cases, the brightness increased with UFO acceleration. Or, conversely, if the object slows down, they found the brightness decreased. They also found that in 3 cases, there was a pulsing or a blinking effect during acceleration. In 22 cases, they found that the color does seem to change during acceleration. For instance, in 9 cases, there was a redshift. As the object accelerated, the object turned more and more red. In 10 cases, it changed from white to another specific color, to or from another specific color. And in only 3 cases, the object went from dark to a specific color during acceleration. Next slide. Again, the fractal energy exchange mechanism suggests or explains that by pumping more or less energy into the surrounding air, this may have a propulsive effect. And it may be reactive in the traditional sense of action and reaction, and it may not. There may be a totally different mechanism. I'd like to briefly talk about non-symmetric UFO forms or shapes. Next slide. And here I simply would like to apply the fractal concept to now the edge dynamics. This is a very typical kind of a UFO photograph. At one edge of the photograph, which you have already seen in many cases, Lago de Cote in Costa Rica, you have a very smooth edge, and you have a fractal edge elsewhere. And in these cases, they are not symmetrical. There's an asymmetry about them. Let me suggest to you that the apparent edge, what you and I see forming the edge of the object in photographs, not all, but some photographs, may not be solid material at all, such as metal, but rather a dynamic energy exchange surface that is momentary and deliberate, perhaps, to achieve a particular effect. And cloaking and stealth technology may be one of those effects. Next slide. Also, I would point out, before going on, that the asymmetry effect is so large in these photographs that it is not a film grain effect. The film grain is much, much smaller than the OVNI. Well, here's a photograph taken from the air in Canada at flight level 330, and for those of you who are not pilots, 33,000 feet. During the daytime, looking down to the top of clouds. So this is a very high altitude photograph from a passenger plane looking down over Canada. And what the photographer, his name was Murray Charlevoix, saw and photographed was an asymmetrical disc above the clouds. And he watched it for quite a long time so that he could get his camera out and focus it and take a picture. And you can just barely notice an asymmetrical shape. That, to me, is not an oval. That is a non-symmetric shape. Let me show you another example. This photograph was also taken from the air on August of 1956. It's 27 August, by an F-86 jet pilot. His name was Robert Childerhouse of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was flying at high altitude, as you can see, during the day. It's a beautiful picture in color. And he saw this very, very intense phenomenon above the clouds. It was not at the surface of the earth, for at least 3 minutes. Long enough to get his camera, again, focus it, set it properly, and take this picture. His estimate of the distance from his aircraft to that phenomenon was approximately 3.7 miles, roughly 6 kilometers. When we do the computer enhancement, the computer analyses of that shape, it is not symmetrical. Next slide. Well, I'm almost finished. It brings me to my summary that I would like to leave you with and conclusions. My first point, because we have completely misunderstood the nature of UFO today, we do not understand what they are. We must remain completely open-minded to all new possible explanations for the phenomenon. And it's because of that fact I'm here today. I'm presenting a new concept to you that may be disregarded. It may have no support within the scientific world, and that is fine. But at least it would challenge the scientists to look and to examine and to discuss and to debate this idea. That is the tradition of science. Second, I conclude that UFO photographs, some photographs I must say, and visual reports that would suggest a smooth metal surface may not be metal at all, but the result of a fractal-based energy exchange mechanism such as I proposed here. Third, raise this up please. I propose that UFO flight dynamics should correlate positively with the reported dynamic changes in shape and edge characteristics following this theory, so that the distortion or fractal growth effect on one side of the vehicle, or whatever it is, should be related in some regular way to the direction of flight. Fourth, that it is possible, relative to the energy seed inside the object, for an asymmetric exchange of energy. The energy does not have to come out in what we call 4 pi steradian directions, which means a sphere, from the center of the sphere. It can come out in a plane, or 2 planes, or a wedge of time. Doesn't matter. That's a function of how it is distributed and managed, basically. And that this asymmetric exchange of energy may account for some of the UFO photographs showing a fractal-like effect. Next slide, please. So perhaps we have been looking at the surfaces of UFOs and their outlines in the wrong way. What if the photographed surface of shape and surface of a UFO is somehow distorted by the interaction of radiation, energy, let's say, given off by itself or absorbed from the surrounding atmosphere, or surrounding air? What if the perceived surface and shape of the UFO is only temporary? It is momentary. It can maintain a shape and a size for 12 hours if it wants to. And it will look solid, constant, rigid, manufactured, but in a moment it could collapse. Or it can expand, or it can change shape, or it can change its energy distribution of different colors. Next slide. And you may sigh with relief, this is my last slide. I would conclude that a 3-dimensional oblate spheroid, and that's a geometrical name in English for a particular shape, roughly a flying saucer, that shape of a volume is an efficient aerodynamic form or shape with which to apply a segmented energy exchange mechanism. I'm not saying that all UFOs must be saucers in shape. I'm simply saying that from almost an engineering point of view, it seems to make some common sense to use an oblate spheroid for that purpose. But I must end by saying, even if we find that a fractal kind of UFO shape or size effect is proven, and I say proven in the sense of science proving something with more evidence, this will not necessarily support either a natural or an extraterrestrial origin explanation for UFO. I'm not standing here and saying these are objects from outer space. I don't know. What I am saying is that the phenomenon is so mysterious, it is so challenging, that it deserves further study. And I'd just like to leave you with a challenge for those of you who are technically trained and interested in this subject, that you would seriously consider this. You can just go through the fractals if you like, if they show up. Some of them don't show up very well. Just concluding with some other fractal designs here. I would challenge you to think seriously of this hypothesis, this fractal energy exchange mechanism, and to explore it from your own point of view, to evaluate it from optics, from trapped magnetic field point of view, from theoretical physics point of view, from engineering point of view. And I'll be delighted to correspond with you and talk further, as we do in science, to refine the concept, or if you can convince me, throw it out. I am not married to this. I'm married to my wife. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
Preguntas concretas, definitivas, por favor, se identifican y en lo posible, vuelvo a repetir, bastante cortas las preguntas. Vamos al punto inmediato.
Víctor Becchietti, de Argentina, psicólogo, piloto civil. Nos ha sucedido ver en la zona de Victoria, a simple vista o con binoculares, este tipo de fenómenos lumínicos. Lo que nos ha llamado la atención es que con los amplificadores de luz residual o los visores nocturnos, como se les llaman actualmente, no son observados. O sea, las personas lo ven con el binocular, pero no se ven con el visor nocturno. ¿Cómo puede ser esto?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would say that what you have discovered by that experiment is a very, what we would call monochromatic radiation, meaning that if you see something that's white, like this paper is white, yes? Blanco. It's made up of almost all of the wavelengths that your eye can perceive, together, combined in the brain to produce white. However, if you see this laser, which is red, you can see the red, well, good. That red that you see with your eye is only about 2 wavelengths long. Not all wavelengths at all, but just 2 that look red to your eye. So with the night vision goggles, what it is doing is cutting off the spectrum of light that your eye is sensitive to in such a way that it can amplify by 100,000 times, usually infrared, usually heat, but not always. Does that make clear? Is that clear? So you have discovered a very interesting fact. Thank you.
Pedro Muñoz de ESO, Mr. Haines. Quisiera preguntar si es posible hacer un análisis fractal a filmaciones de video, independiente. No quiero meterme en el tema si son verdaderas o no, si la filmación de video es técnicamente factible hacer ese análisis.
Señor Muñoz, no. The problem is in the resolution. The video has such a poor resolution, usually, all of the home recorders we have, the camcorders, are usually about 300 or 400 lines of resolution. That is equivalent to the grain of the film in a photograph, in a concept. However, it's about 1,000 times bigger than the grain of the film. And so for fractal geometry to appear, it must be very fine resolution and a large effect.
Por un lado, o la sensación que tiene un día por sí mismo, teórico vinculante. En el fondo, porque uno muchas veces ve que el fenómeno tiene un comportamiento inteligente. Esa es la pregunta.
Yeah. Well, that's an opinion that you share with us. That's not a question. But let me comment anyway. I think you may be combining two separate issues. And one is intelligence that must be inside the vehicle, like the analogy of a pilot flying an airplane. In comparison with a pilot flying an airplane from the ground remotely. So I might agree with you that there is intelligence associated with this fractal effect, and I think there probably is, but I don't know yet. But that's very different from saying that the fractal manipulation of energy must have a crew compartment. I don't believe it has to. We can already design and build and operate remotely piloted vehicles, RPVs, and they're used for surveillance all the time. Israel is developing some elegant RPVs right now, as are other countries. Well, there's intelligence behind an RPV, and it can fly many places and stay up for a long time and take good quality imagery, but the intelligence is not inside it, it's on the ground. Is that clear?
Muy bien, yo no resisto la tentación de sí hacerle la última pregunta, el derecho está aquí arriba, a Dr. Haines. Así, bien cortito. Una, ¿hace cuánto tiempo desarrolló usted esta teoría? Dos, si ha conversado con los físicos respecto o solicitando una opinión con respecto a esta teoría.
Well, as many ideas occur, I'm sure you've had the same experience in the shower. They come at unexpected times. This idea came to me approximately 4 years ago. But because of timidity, understand? I waited. And I said, no one will accept it. It's stupid. It's a stupido idea. And so I didn't say anything. And so over the last 2 years, I have begun to add details and come across information. And as I talk to audiences around the world, they come to me afterward and say, I have a photograph for you. Or I have some idea related to this. You see? I'm sorry, what was your second question? Which is physicists, yes. Have I talked to physicists? The answer is yes, but only a few. Most of the physicists that I know are very bright, hardworking, busy people. They tell me that they may be interested, but they don't have time to spend on my subject. They want to spend time on their subject. I can understand that. I don't expect all physicists to have that amount of time. But I would be delighted to talk with any of you who have this kind of background, to tell me where I'm wrong.